In 1938, the Nazis stood proudly inside their newest ammunition factory, a marvel of German engineering that would help fuel their war machine. The production lines hummed with perfect efficiency. The ventilation systems worked flawlessly. Every measurement, every calculation, every structural beam was exactly where it needed to be. There was just one problem. None of them knew that the brilliant mind behind this masterpiece was a Jewish engineer they had expelled from Germany just months earlier. This is the incredible true story of revenge served cold through blueprints in mathematics, a tale of how one man's genius turned Nazi efficiency against itself, and how the greatest act of sabotage came not from explosives or bullets, but from a pencil and a drafting table. If you love stories of hidden heroes and poetic justice from World War II, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't believe how this ends. Chapter 1: The Architect of Precision. Berlin, 1933. Dr. Samuel Hoffmann stood in his office at one of Germany's most prestigious engineering firms, surrounded by blueprints that represented 15 years of innovation. At 42 years old, he was at the peak of his career, a specialist in industrial ventilation systems and factory design, with patents that had revolutionized German manufacturing. His systems weren't just good, they were revolutionary. Hoffmann had solved problems that had plagued industrial engineers for decades. How do you move toxic fumes through a factory without creating dead zones where workers would suffocate? How do you maintain precise temperature control in buildings the size of aircraft hangars? How do you design ventilation that could handle the specific chemical reactions of ammunition production without causing explosions? These weren't theoretical questions. In the industrial age, they were matters of life, death, and profit. And Hoffmann had the answers. His colleagues respected him. His clients trusted him. The German industrial complex depended on innovations that bore his fingerprints, even if his name rarely appeared in public. He was the invisible genius who made German precision possible. Then came the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. Overnight, everything changed. It didn't matter that Hoffmann had served Germany in World War I. It didn't matter that his engineering innovations had put Germany ahead of its competitors. It didn't matter that he considered himself German first, Jewish second. The only thing that mattered was that he was Jewish. The letters began arriving. First, polite requests that he step back from certain government contracts. Then, more direct orders. His name was removed from patents. His contributions were attributed to Aryan colleagues. By 1937, he was forbidden from working on any projects connected to the military or government infrastructure. In early 1938, the final blow came. He was expelled from the German Association of Engineers. Without membership, he couldn't legally practice his profession. His life's work, his identity, his purpose, erased with the stroke of a bureaucratic pen. But Dr. Hoffmann had seen this coming. For 3 years, he had watched the walls closing in. And unlike many who hoped the madness would pass, Hoffmann had prepared. He had secured exit visas for himself and his family. He had made contact with colleagues in Britain. He had hidden away copies of his most important research. And he had one final project to complete before he left, a factory for the Third Reich. Chapter 2: The Last Commission. The contract arrived in December 1937, 3 months before Hoffmann's official expulsion. It came through a mid-level bureaucrat in the Reich Ministry of Armaments, someone who either didn't know or didn't care about Hoffman's Jewish heritage, or more likely, someone who knew that finding another engineer with Hoffman's expertise would be nearly impossible. The project was massive, a new ammunition production facility in the industrial Ruhr Valley. It needed to produce artillery shells, rifle ammunition, and eventually, components for larger weapons. The building would span 3 acres under a single roof, employ thousands of workers, and operate around the clock. The technical requirements were staggering. Ammunition production involved volatile chemicals, explosive compounds, and processes that generated toxic fumes. One spark in the wrong place, one pocket of accumulated gas, one ventilation failure, and the entire facility could become a massive bomb. This wasn't just an engineering challenge, it was a deadly puzzle where mistakes could kill hundreds. For any other engineer in Germany, this would be a career-defining project, a chance to prove their worth to the Reich. The pay was generous. The prestige immense. Success could guarantee a comfortable position throughout the war that everyone knew was coming. For Hoffman, it was an opportunity of a different kind. He accepted the commission with the humble gratitude expected of someone in his position. Yes, he would be honored to serve. Yes, he understood the importance of the project. Yes, he could have preliminary designs ready within 6 weeks. He told no one about his plan, not his wife, not his children, not the handful of trusted colleagues who might have understood. The genius of what he was about to do lay in its subtlety. It would require no sabotage that could be detected, no obviously flawed designs that would raise suspicion. Instead, Hoffman would give the Nazis exactly what they asked for, a factory that worked perfectly. At least, it would work perfectly at first. He spent his evenings in his home office, drafting and redrafting. The basic structure was sound, it had to be, or the fraud would be obvious. The production lines made sense. The electrical systems met all codes. The building's skeleton was properly engineered for the loads it would bear. But in the ventilation systems, in the airflow calculations, in the placement of exhaust vents and intake fans, Hoffman planted his seeds of destruction. He designed subtle flaws that wouldn't manifest for years. Calculations that were correct for initial operations but would fail under sustained use. Material specifications that would degrade in predictable ways. Ventilation patterns that would gradually reverse, creating the exact toxic conditions the system was meant to prevent. The factory would pass every inspection. It would operate flawlessly during testing. And then, slowly, inevitably, it would begin to fail in ways that would be almost impossible to diagnose. In February 1938, Hoffman submitted his completed designs. 2 weeks later, he received final payment. In March, his membership in the Engineering Association was revoked. In April, as the first foundation stones of his factory were being laid, Dr. Samuel Hoffman and his family boarded a train for Amsterdam, and from there, a ship to England. He left Germany behind forever. But his final masterpiece remained, a time bomb built from blueprints and mathematical precision. Chapter 3: The Factory Rises. Construction began in spring 1938, just as Germany was preparing to annex Austria and eyeing Czechoslovakia. The Ruhr Valley facility was one of dozens of armament factories being built or expanded, part of Hitler's urgent rearmament program that violated the Treaty of Versailles but faced little opposition from the Western powers. The construction supervisor, an ambitious Nazi Party member named Klaus Richter, was ecstatic about the project. It would be his crowning achievement, proof of German engineering superiority. The designs he had been given were, in his words, typically brilliant German precision. He had no idea they had been created by the Jewish engineer whose name had already been scrubbed from the project documentation. The building rose quickly. Germany's industrial capacity was still among the world's finest, and workers took pride in their craftsmanship. The massive steel framework went up first, creating a cathedral of industry. Then came the walls, the roof, the internal structures. By autumn 1938, as Kristallnacht shattered windows across Germany and made clear the true nature of Nazi hatred, the factory's basic construction was complete. Teams of specialists moved in to install the complex machinery that would turn raw materials into instruments of death. The ventilation system was a marvel to behold. Massive fans, some 12 feet in diameter, were positioned exactly where Hoffman's blueprints specified. Ductwork threaded through the building like arterial systems, moving air with calculated precision. Exhaust vents punctured the roof at seemingly random points that actually represented complex mathematical calculations. During inspections, everything checked out perfectly. Airflow measurements matched the specifications. Toxic fumes were carried away from work areas. Temperature controls maintained the precise conditions needed for chemical processes. Safety officials praised the design. One inspector noted in his report that the ventilation system was perhaps over-engineered, showing typical Jewish obsession with unnecessary complexity, not knowing how right he was about the Jewish part, and how wrong about everything else. The factory opened in January 1939, 8 months before Germany invaded Poland. The first production runs were spectacular successes. The assembly lines moved smoothly. Workers reported excellent conditions. The ammunition produced met all quality standards. Photographs from the opening ceremony showed Nazi officials standing proudly inside the facility, swastika banners hanging from the rafters, everyone celebrating German ingenuity and Aryan superiority. In England, Dr. Hoffman read about the factory's successful opening in a German newspaper he subscribed to. He smiled quietly and said nothing. He knew what they didn't, the real test hadn't begun yet. The ventilation system wasn't designed for occasional use. It was designed for continuous, around-the-clock operation under wartime conditions. And under those conditions, Hoffman's carefully calculated flaws would begin to emerge. But that would take time. First, there would need to be a war. The factory would need to run at maximum capacity for months. The materials he had specified, which looked identical to proper materials but had subtle differences in their composition, would need to degrade. The Nazis had built their factory exactly according to plan. They just didn't know whose plan it really was, or what that plan would ultimately achieve. Chapter 4: The Slow Catastrophe. September 1939. Germany invaded Poland, and the factory shifted into high gear. What had been impressive production numbers during peacetime became mandatory quotas that had to be met regardless of cost. The facility ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Shifts rotated, but the machines never stopped. For the first year, everything seemed fine. Production exceeded expectations. The factory became a model facility, and officials from other armament plants visited to study its efficiency. Klaus Richter was promoted. The workers received bonuses. But by spring 1940, as Germany prepared to invade France, the first problems appeared. Workers in the chemical processing section began complaining about headaches. At first, supervisors dismissed it as malingering, people looking for excuses to avoid work. But the complaints increased. Headaches became dizziness. Dizziness became nausea. Several workers collapsed at their stations. Medical examinations revealed elevated levels of toxic fumes in their blood. The ventilation system was inspected. On paper, everything still worked perfectly. Airflow measurements seemed adequate. The fans were running. But something was wrong. The inspectors couldn't find any single point of failure, just a general sense that the air quality wasn't what it should be. The solution, they decided, was to increase ventilation, run the fans at higher speeds, open more vents. It helped temporarily. Production continued. But Hoffman had anticipated this response. He had designed a system where increased ventilation would actually accelerate the degradation. Higher fan speeds created more stress on components he had deliberately underspecified. More open vents created pressure imbalances that disrupted the careful airflow patterns. By late 1940, the problems were undeniable. Accident rates increased. Production quality suffered. Some ammunition batches failed quality control due to improper curing caused by temperature fluctuations. Workers began requesting transfers. The facility that had been a showcase became a problem. Nazi efficiency demanded solutions. Engineers were brought in, competent men, but none with Hoffman's genius. They made modifications. They replaced components. They redesigned sections of the ventilation system. But they were working blind. They didn't understand the original design's true logic because Hoffman had hidden it beneath layers of apparently standard engineering. Each fix addressed a symptom while missing the underlying cause. Some modifications even made things worse, creating new problems that compounded the old ones. By 1941, as Germany invaded the Soviet Union and needed every bullet it could produce, the factory was operating at barely 70% capacity. Worse, maintaining even that level required constant repairs and workarounds. Resources that should have been dedicated to expansion were instead devoted to keeping the facility functional. The Nazi officials were furious. How could German engineering fail like this? Investigations were launched. Some engineers were dismissed for incompetence. The original blueprints were examined, but they showed nothing obviously wrong. They were, after all, brilliant designs that had been executed perfectly. The idea that the problem was built into the original design, that someone had deliberately created a factory designed to slowly fail, never occurred to anyone. It was too subtle, too patient, too clever. It required thinking in timescales of years, not weeks. It required accepting that someone had sacrificed immediate sabotage for long-term degradation. In England, Dr. Hoffman continued his work for British engineering firms, contributing to the Allied war effort in legitimate ways. He never spoke publicly about the factory. He never wrote about it. He never confessed to anyone what he had done. But sometimes, When news came of ammunition shortages in Germany, of production problems in their factories, he would allow himself a private moment of satisfaction. His revenge was working exactly as planned, slowly, inevitably, invisibly. Chapter 5: The Engineer's Nightmare. By 1942, the factory had become a case study in engineering failure, though no one understood why. The Reich Ministry of Armaments sent their best technical minds to diagnose the problem. What they found baffled them. The ventilation system was failing, but not in any normal way. It wasn't a simple breakdown of components that could be replaced. Instead, it was as if the entire system was working against itself, creating problems that cascaded through the facility in unpredictable ways. Fumes that should have been vented outside were somehow recirculating back into production areas. Temperature control systems that had worked perfectly for the first year were now unable to maintain stable conditions. Sections of ductwork were corroding from the inside at rates that seemed impossible given the materials supposedly used. One engineer, a careful man named Weber, spent 3 weeks analyzing the ventilation design. He concluded that while ingenious, it contained subtle mathematical errors that only became apparent under sustained operation. He recommended a complete redesign. But there was no time. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. Every factory was desperately needed. Shutting down the facility for months to rebuild its ventilation system was unthinkable. Instead, they implemented more patches, more temporary fixes, more workarounds. The facility limped along, but the cost was tremendous. Worker illness rates were the highest in the region. Production efficiency continued to drop. The ammunition produced was acceptable but not exceptional, and in war, exceptional matters. By 1943, accounting experts calculated that the factory consumed twice the resources per unit produced compared to similar facilities. It had become a drain on the war effort rather than an asset. What made it worse was that nobody could explain why. The same designs had been used as templates for other factories, but without Hoffman's subtle sabotage, those facilities worked fine. This made the Ruhr Valley plant's problems seem like they must be due to poor management or worker sabotage, leading to brutal crackdowns that further damaged morale. Some workers were executed for suspected sabotage. Managers were replaced. Security was increased. None of it helped because the real saboteur had left Germany years ago, and his sabotage was mathematical, not mechanical. In one particularly bitter irony, a Nazi inspector in 1943 filed a report suggesting that the factory's problems might stem from its original design being corrupted by Jewish influence, not knowing how precisely correct he was. But by then, all records of Hoffman's involvement had been thoroughly scrubbed. The design was officially the work of German engineers, and admitting otherwise would have been ideologically unacceptable. The factory struggled on through 1944 as the Reich crumbled. Allied bombing eventually damaged it, but by then, it hardly mattered. The facility had been underperforming for years, victim of a sabotage so elegant that the Nazis never even recognized it as sabotage. Dr. Hoffman, meanwhile, had found a quiet life in England. He taught at a university, consulted on various projects, and watched from afar as the regime that had expelled him destroyed itself. He never sought recognition for what he had done. The satisfaction of knowing was enough. Chapter 6: The Truth Emerges. The full story of Dr. Samuel Hoffman's revenge didn't emerge until decades after the war. Even then, it came to light almost by accident. In 1967, a graduate student in engineering history at the University of Manchester was researching German industrial facilities during World War II. While examining captured Nazi documents, she found references to a particularly problematic ammunition factory in the Ruhr Valley. Intrigued by the technical mystery, why had it failed so consistently, she dug deeper. She discovered the original blueprints, now held in British archives. They were brilliant designs, she noted, but something about them felt odd. The ventilation calculations were extraordinarily complex, more sophisticated than typical for the era. Almost as a footnote, she found a reference to the original designer. The name had been partially redacted in Nazi files, but cross-referencing with other documents revealed it, Dr. Samuel Hoffman. By remarkable coincidence, Hoffman was still alive, now 86 years old and living quietly in Manchester. The student contacted him for an interview about his wartime work. At first, Hoffman was reticent. But as they talked, and as he realized she had actually understood something was unusual about the factory designs, he began to open up. What emerged was the confession of the most elegant act of sabotage in the war. Hoffman explained his methodology. He had designed a ventilation system that worked perfectly under test conditions but would fail gradually under sustained use. He had specified materials that looked identical to proper specifications but had subtle compositional differences that would cause premature degradation. He had created airflow patterns that were stable at low intensity but would become chaotic under the continuous operation of wartime production. I gave them exactly what they asked for, he explained with a slight smile. A factory that could produce ammunition. I just didn't give them one that could do it well, or for long. The mathematical elegance was breathtaking. Hoffman had essentially created a machine that would slowly commit suicide, and he had done it in such a way that every attempt to fix it would only accelerate its decline. When asked why he had never revealed this before, Hoffman was philosophical. What would have been the point? During the war, secrecy was essential. After the war, everyone wanted to move on. And besides, he added, revenge is most satisfying when you're the only one who knows you've achieved it. The student's research was published in an obscure engineering journal in 1969. Hoffman died in 1971, satisfied that his story had been told, if only to a small audience who could appreciate its technical brilliance. Over the years, military historians have tried to calculate the impact of Hoffman's sabotage. Conservative estimates suggest the factory's underperformance cost Germany hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition, enough to supply several divisions for months. The resources spent trying to fix it, the engineering talent diverted to the problem, the worker morale damaged by the facility's reputation, all these had cascading effects. One historian noted that while Hoffman's sabotage didn't change the outcome of the war, it exemplified something important. Resistance came in many forms, not just guns and explosives, but also from a pencil in the hands of a brilliant mind who refused to let injustice go unanswered. Today, the site where the factory stood is an industrial park. There's no monument to Dr. Hoffman, no plaque explaining what happened there. But in engineering schools, his story is sometimes told as a remarkable example of how expertise can be weaponized, and how the most devastating sabotage can be the kind that nobody recognizes until it's far too late. the Nazis thought they were expelling a Jewish engineer. What they actually did was turn one of their greatest assets into their most patient enemy. They built their factory with pride, never knowing it was designed from the beginning to fail them when they needed it most. Dr. Samuel Hoffman had his revenge, served cold through mathematics and patience. And the beauty of it was that the Nazis never even knew they'd been defeated by the man they'd thrown away. Epilogue: The Engineer's Legacy. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Dr. Samuel Hoffman's modest flat in Manchester as he sat at his desk, surrounded by papers and memories. It was April 1970, and at 89 years old, he knew his time was growing short. The graduate student's visit 3 years earlier had stirred something in him, a need to finally put the full story on paper, not for glory, but for truth. He pulled out a leather journal he had kept hidden for decades and began to write with the same precise hand that had once drafted blueprints for the Third Reich. "I want it understood," he wrote, "that what I did was not motivated by hatred, but by love. Love for the profession they tried to take from me. Love for the country that had been my home before it rejected me. Love for the idea that intelligence and patience can triumph over brutality and force." Hoffman had spent the war years in England doing legitimate war work, designing ventilation systems for British factories, consulting on industrial safety, teaching the next generation of engineers. He never mentioned the Ruhr Valley factory to his British colleagues. The secret sat quietly in his mind, a private knowledge that sustained him through the darkest days when news came of concentration camps and mass murder. After the war, he learned what had happened to many he'd left behind. His elderly parents, who had refused to leave Germany, perished in their Scienstadt. 3 of his former colleagues from the engineering firm died in Auschwitz. The synagogue where he'd occasionally attended services was destroyed during Kristallnacht and never rebuilt. "People sometimes ask me if I felt guilty," he wrote in his journal, "knowing that my factory continued to produce ammunition even if inefficiently, and that some of those bullets surely killed Allied soldiers. The answer is yes. I struggled with this. But I also knew that factory would have been built regardless. Better that it functioned poorly than perfectly." The mathematics of his sabotage had been even more sophisticated than he'd revealed to the student. Hoffman had designed the failure cascade to accelerate over time. The longer the factory ran, the worse it would perform. By 1944, internal Nazi documents, later captured by the Allies, showed the facility operating at barely 40% capacity and requiring constant emergency repairs. One document Hoffman obtained after the war gave him particular satisfaction, a furious memo from Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, demanding to know why one of our most promising facilities has become one of our most problematic. The memo ordered a complete investigation into possible sabotage by workers or foreign agents. They never suspected the sabotage had been built into the foundation itself, signed off by their own officials, paid for with their own money. Hoffman's journal revealed something else. He hadn't been entirely alone in his knowledge. Before leaving Germany, he had confided in one person, his mentor, an elderly Aryan engineer named Friedrich Bauer, who had protected Hoffman as long as he could. Bauer couldn't stop Hoffman's expulsion, but he had helped ensure Hoffman got the factory commission as a final project. "Friedrich understood what I was doing," Hoffman wrote. "He never said so explicitly, but when I showed him the designs, he looked at me for a long moment and said, 'This is remarkable work, Samuel. Very subtle. Very patient. Then he approved everything without question. He died in 1940, may his memory be a blessing. I hope he knew, in those final months, that his final act of rebellion was working. The journal also contained Hoffman's technical notes, detailed explanations of exactly how he designed the failure cascade. He included calculations, material specifications, ventilation flow patterns. It read like a master class in inverse engineering, how to design something that appears perfect but contains the seeds of its own destruction. I am recording this, he explained, not as a blueprint for future sabotage, but as a testament to what the human mind can achieve when stripped of everything but knowledge and determination. They took my home, my career, my country. But they could not take what I knew, and they could not prevent me from using that knowledge against them. In 1971, shortly before his death, Hoffman added a final entry. A young Israeli engineer had tracked him down, wanting to discuss his story for a book about Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. Hoffman was initially hesitant but eventually agreed to meet. He asked me if I considered myself a hero, Hoffman wrote. I told him no. Heroes act in the moment, risking everything for immediate results. What I did required no courage. I was already leaving Germany, already safe. It required only patience and precision, which are an engineer's stock in trade. But then he said something that struck me. He said, "You weaponized your knowledge. You proved that expertise is power, and that power can't be stripped away by laws or threats." Every Jewish scientist, engineer, artist, and thinker who the Nazis expelled or murdered, they threw away their own strength. You made them pay for that mistake. Hoffman paused in his writing, considering this. Finally, he added, perhaps he is right. Perhaps my small act of rebellion was meaningful not because of how many bullets it prevented from being made, but because it proved a point. You cannot build a superior society by expelling your best minds. Excellence doesn't care about race or religion. Genius doesn't check your papers before revealing itself. The journal's final pages contain something unexpected: regret. I wonder sometimes about the German workers who suffered in that factory, Hoffman wrote. They were not my enemies. Many were probably decent people trapped in an evil system. The toxic fumes that sickened them, that was never my intention. I designed the sabotage to affect production, not people. But war is not precise. Consequences ripple outward in ways we cannot control. If I could go back, would I do it again? Yes. But I would carry the weight of those workers' suffering on my conscience, as I carry so many other weights. Revenge, even justified revenge, is never clean. It never affects only those who deserve it. Dr. Samuel Hoffman died on September 15, 1971, 3 months after writing that final entry. His funeral was small, a handful of colleagues, former students, and his surviving family members. The rabbi who officiated knew nothing of the factory, only that Hoffman had been a refugee who built a quiet, dignified life in England. The journal remained with Hoffman's papers until 1985, when his daughter donated his personal archive to the Imperial War Museum in London. There, historians discovered the full technical details of what he had done. The journal was eventually published in 1992 as part of a larger volume about unconventional resistance during World War II. Today, Hoffman's story occupies a unique place in the history of the Holocaust and World War II. It's taught in engineering ethics classes as an example of how professional knowledge carries moral responsibility. It appears in Holocaust education as a story of resistance that went beyond physical rebellion. Military historians cite it as an example of how industrial sabotage can affect warfare. But perhaps most significantly, it has become a parable about the cost of hatred and exclusion. The Nazis' racial ideology caused them to expel or murder thousands of brilliant minds, scientists, engineers, artists, doctors, intellectuals. Many fled to Allied countries where their expertise helped defeat the Reich. Others, like Hoffman, found subtler ways to resist. One historian calculated that if Germany had retained all the Jewish scientists and engineers it expelled or killed, their technical advantage might have extended the war significantly, possibly even changing its outcome. Instead, Nazi ideology forced them to throw away their own strength, and in Hoffman's case, to literally pay one of their victims to sabotage them. The site of the Ruhr Valley factory was finally demolished in 1978. Nothing marks the location now except an industrial building that houses a tech startup. But in the archives, Hoffman's blueprints remain, studied by engineering students and military historians, a testament to what one brilliant mind accomplished with nothing but knowledge, patience, and a pencil. Dr. Samuel Hoffman never sought recognition. He never wanted to be called a hero. He simply wanted to prove that the Nazis were wrong about racial superiority, wrong about who deserved to call themselves German, wrong about the consequences of their hatred. And in his quiet, patient, mathematically precise way, he did exactly that. The factory stands as his monument, not the building itself, which is gone, but the idea of it. A reminder that true engineering, true genius, true excellence cannot be defined by nationality or religion or race. It can only be recognized by its results. And Hoffman's results spoke for themselves. The Nazis built their factory with pride, ran it with determination, and failed with confusion. They never knew they had been defeated by the very man they thought they had defeated, the Jewish engineer they expelled, the brilliant mind they threw away, the patient genius who smiled quietly and let mathematics exact his revenge. In the end, Dr. Samuel Hoffman had the last word. It was written not in speeches or manifestos, but in blueprints and calculations, a legacy of resistance that proves the pen, or in his case the drafting pencil, truly can be mightier than the sword. If this story of hidden heroism inspired you, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible untold stories from World War II. What other secret acts of resistance do you think happened during the war? Let me know in the comments below.